The ancient vow shattered the silence of the Grand Council chamber like a thunderclap, and every vampire lord in the room turned to stare at Marina Sinclair, as though she had just confessed to murdering the sun. She stood at the center of an obsidian dais, her curly brown hair escaping its pins, her translator's badge hanging crooked against her blazer, holding a single sheet of vellum so old it had gone amber at the edges. Her hands were perfectly steady, her heart was not. "Read it again," said Lord Valdrek Ashbourne, the eldest of the High Council, his white hair swept back like snow over a mountain peak. His pale eyes narrowed into something between fury and disbelief. "You cannot possibly have translated the blood-right vow correctly. Scholars far older than you have attempted it for 3 centuries. Then they were looking in the wrong dialect," Marina said. Her voice did not shake. She had practiced not letting it shake for the last 4 years. Ever since she had accepted a research position at the Nocturne Archive, buried 6 levels below London's Museum of Natural History, a position that had come with a salary barely above minimum wage, a desk the size of a cutting board, and the daily mockery of every vampire academic who thought a 28-year-old human woman had no business touching documents older than entire civilizations. She met Valdrek's gaze. The vow was written in early sanguine script, not classical sanguine. There is a grammatical structure in early sanguine, where a binding oath can contain its own negation clause, embedded in the 3rd syllabic tier. Every previous translator worked from the surface layer. I worked from the 3rd tier. The blood-right vow does not chain Magnus Aurel to this council. It releases him. The chamber erupted. 40 vampire lords, all ancient, all white-skinned and white-haired, and draped in the kind of tailored authority that came from watching centuries pass like seasons, rose from their seats simultaneously. The sound that filled the room was not quite shouting, not quite the hiss of predators, but something in between that made the bones behind Marina's ears vibrate unpleasantly. At the far end of the chamber, in a containment alcove sealed with silver-threaded glass, Magnus Aurel raised his head. She had seen him only in archive photographs before today, always blurred as though even captured light was reluctant to hold his image too long. In person, he was something else entirely. Tall, impossibly so, with the kind of lean, precise build that suggested every inch of him had been carved with a purpose. His white hair fell to his jaw, disheveled from what she guessed was 2 years of imprisonment. His skin was the color of winter moonlight, and his eyes, which found hers across the chaos of the erupting chamber with an accuracy that made her breath catch, were a deep arterial red that she had read described in old texts as the color of a vampire who had not fed in a very long time. He did not look weak, he looked like a compressed storm. "Archivist," he said, and his voice cut through the noise the way a blade cuts through silk, effortlessly and with absolute precision. "You translated the vow. It was not a question." It was something closer to recognition, as if he had been waiting for this specific moment and had simply not known what it would look like until now. "I translated the vow," Marina confirmed. Lord Valdrek slammed his palm against the dais railing. "The girl is a human researcher. She has no standing in this court. Her translation carries no legal weight under blood law." "Under blood law," said Magnus, still holding Marina's gaze. "Any being capable of rendering an accurate translation of a binding document is entitled to present that translation before the High Council for verification. Article 17 of the Covenant of Courts. Are you telling me, Valdrek, that you intend to break Article 17? The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Marina exhaled slowly. She had found Article 17 3 weeks ago, buried in a footnote of a document she had only been examining to catalogue its physical condition. She had sat at her tiny desk at 2 in the morning, with cold coffee going stale beside her, and read it 4 times before she understood what it meant. Then she had gone home, stared at her ceiling, and made a choice that she had been quietly terrified of ever since. She had come here anyway. Valdrek looked at her with an expression that made her feel approximately as significant as a piece of furniture, and twice as inconvenient. "We will recess," he announced. "The council will verify the translation independently." "You will find my work holds," Marina said. "You sound very confident for someone who could be removed from this building in a great many ways," Valdrek replied, and though his tone was perfectly civil, the meaning underneath it was not. She did not flinch. She was not the kind of woman who flinched at implications, even dangerous ones. She had spent 4 years learning to stand her ground in rooms that had been built to make her feel small. She simply held the vellum document with both hands, met the old vampire lord's eyes and said, "Then the council should move quickly. Because I have already filed a notarized copy of my translation with 3 separate legal archives, including the Neutral Covenant House in Geneva. If anything happens to me before verification is complete, the question of why will be considerably more interesting than the question of my translation's accuracy." Magnus Aurel, behind his silver-threaded glass, made a sound that was very close to a laugh. The recess lasted 3 hours. Marina spent them in a waiting room that was clearly designed to intimidate, all black marble and flickering gas-style lamps and furniture with sharp Gothic edges that encouraged discomfort. 2 council guards stood at the door, both young by vampire standards, which still meant they were older than any human institution Marina could name. They watched her with the cautious wariness of people who could not quite categorize what she was. She used the time to drink terrible tea from a thermos she had brought in her bag, eat a cereal bar, and review her notes. She was not unafraid. She was simply not allowing fear to be in charge. Her phone buzzed. A message from her friend and colleague Priya, who worked in the Archive's Human Staff Division and was the only person who had known what Marina was planning. The message read, "Are you alive? Please be alive."
Also, did it work?
Marina typed back, "Still alive. Jury is literally still out. Will update when possible." Priya sent back a string of praying hands emoji and a single word, legend. Marina allowed herself a small smile, tucked her phone away, and waited. When the council reconvened, the atmosphere had changed. Not softened exactly, but shifted in the way a battlefield shifts when one side realizes the terrain is not what they thought it was. Valdrek took his seat with the rigid precision of a man maintaining dignity through considerable effort. The other council members arranged themselves with careful, deliberate stillness. "The translation," Valdrek said, each word clearly costing him something, "has been verified as accurate." The murmur that ran through the assembled lords was not happy. Marina kept her face neutral. "Then the provisions of the blood-right vow must be honored," said one of the council members from the far left, an older woman named Lady Seraphine Crane, whose silver hair was piled in an elaborate architectural arrangement, and whose expression suggested she found this development professionally fascinating rather than personally distressing. She was the only one who had ever, in the 4 years Marina had worked in the archive, acknowledged Marina's research with anything other than dismissal. Magnus Aurel is released from his imprisonment and restored to his full title and rights as heir to the Aurel bloodline. "The Aurel bloodline is extinct," Valdrek said. "The heir is not extinct," Lady Seraphine replied mildly. "He is standing in that alcove looking considerably annoyed. I suggest we open it before he decides to open it himself, which I am told has happened before, with uncomfortable results." The silver-threaded glass dissolved in sections. Magnus stepped out of the alcove with the measured, controlled movement of someone who had spent 2 years perfecting the art of not showing how much he wanted to run. He straightened to his full height, adjusted the collar of his worn but still impeccably cut dark shirt, and looked at the council with an expression that Marina could only describe as politely murderous. Then he looked at her. He crossed the chamber floor in strides that covered ground faster than they should have, stopping directly in front of her with a proximity that most people would have found alarming. Marina held her ground because she had decided that was what she was going to do, even as every instinct she possessed registered the sheer contained force of him at this distance, the cool air around him, the red eyes watching her with an intensity she had no reference for. "Marina Sinclair," he said. "Magnus Aurel," she replied. "You risked your life to bring this translation here. I filed notarized copies in advance. It was a calculated risk. That is not the same thing as a safe one." "No," she agreed, "it isn't." He was quiet for a moment, studying her the way she had studied the vellum, like she was a document he was trying to read in a language he had not expected to encounter. Then something shifted in his expression. Not softened exactly. He did not seem like a man who softened easily, but opened. The way a door opens that has been locked for a very long time. "Why?" he asked. Marina had prepared for this question. She had practiced several versions of the answer on the train down that morning. None of them felt quite right anymore, standing this close to him with the whole council watching. Because, she said, the vow was there, the truth was there. I translated it. That was my job. It was not your job to present it to the High Council under Article 17. No, she said. That was a personal choice. A personal choice that could have gotten you killed. A personal choice that freed you, she said, and something in her voice came out more direct than she had intended, more unguarded, and she watched his red eyes change, deepen, in a way she did not yet have the vocabulary to name. We will discuss this further, he said. It was not a request. I have a train back to London at 7, she said. You will not be taking it. She raised an eyebrow. I beg your pardon. You brought my freedom back from a dead language, Magnus said, still quietly, still with that absolute certainty that she had already noticed, seemed to be his natural register. You have also made yourself a target for every member of this council who did not want that freedom restored. You do not leave this building unaccompanied. Those are not my preferences, Archivist. Those are the facts of your current situation. Marina looked at the council, looked at Valdrek specifically, who was watching this exchange with an expression of contained bitter anger. She thought about the implication he had made earlier, the comment about being removed from the building in a great many ways. All right, she said. Magnus looked briefly surprised, as if he had expected more resistance. Then he simply nodded. And something settled in the line of his shoulders that she interpreted, correctly, as relief. What followed was 4 days that dismantled every assumption Marina had carried about what the hidden world of vampire courts actually looked like. Magnus did not have a residence in the council complex. His family's holdings had been frozen during his imprisonment, a punishment designed to ensure that even if the blood-right vow was ever correctly translated and his rights restored, he would emerge with nothing to his name. He called it, without apparent bitterness, a fairly standard power play by Valdrek's faction. He said it the way you might say the weather has been unreliable, as a fact that was inconvenient and not particularly surprising. They stayed in rooms arranged by Lady Seraphine Crane, who turned out to have sharper political instincts than her mild exterior suggested, and who clearly had an agenda of her own that involved Magnus being free and functional, though she was careful not to explain that agenda to Marina. The rooms were in a section of the complex that Marina had never known existed, a series of deep underground chambers furnished in a style that was simultaneously medieval and modern, stone walls and arched ceilings alongside sleek climate controls and indirect lighting. Her room had a bed with more pillows than she could comfortably count and a bathroom with marble floors, and what appeared to be every amenity she could possibly want, provided by someone who had correctly deduced that she liked very hot showers and decent coffee. Magnus's room was next to hers. She knew this because she heard him moving through the wall that first night, not sleeping, clearly, measured pacing, and the occasional sound of what she identified as old books being opened and closed. He was re-entering himself after 2 years of compression. She understood that without needing to be told. She fell asleep with the sound of him on the other side of the wall, and woke up to a knock at her door. He was dressed in clothes that had clearly been provided recently, dark trousers and a charcoal shirt that fit him properly, his white hair still slightly damp. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee, which he held out with the slightly self-conscious precision of someone who was not accustomed to performing domestic gestures and was determined to execute them correctly anyway. You take it black, he said. I asked Lady Seraphine. You asked Lady Seraphine how I take my coffee. I observed that you were unlikely to want to manage a conversation before your first cup. It seemed efficient to be prepared. Marina took the coffee. It was exactly as she liked it. She studied him over the rim of the cup. You are remarkably considerate for someone described in the council records as a significant security threat. The council records were written by people who found me threatening, he said. People find things threatening when they cannot control them. I am uncontrollable. That is not the same as dangerous. Are you dangerous? He met her eyes. To people who threaten what I care about? Extremely. Marina decided that this was a completely honest answer and that she appreciated it. What do you care about? He was quiet for a moment. Currently, making sure you are not quietly assassinated by Valdrek's faction before we can establish enough political footing to make you untouchable. The matter-of-fact way he said it made the morning feel simultaneously very normal and very strange. Marina drank her coffee. That is a fairly aggressive list of morning priorities. It is a fairly aggressive situation, he said, and something in his expression shifted, a brief crack in the composure, there and gone. You saved my life, Marina. I understand that you had professional and principled reasons for doing so, and I respect those reasons entirely. But the result is that you are now standing in the middle of a 3-century-old power struggle with no protection except Article 17, which has no enforcement mechanism. And you, she said. Yeah. He looked at her. And me, he said quietly. Yes. Over the following days, Marina learned things about Magnus Aurel that the council records which she had read thoroughly had conspicuously omitted. She learned that he spoke 7 languages fluently, 4 of them technically dead, and that he had spent the decades before his imprisonment doing exactly what she did, researching, translating, cataloguing the ancient documents of the vampire world. They had, it turned out, been doing the same work from opposite ends of the same room, metaphorically speaking, except that he had been doing it for 140 years, and she had been doing it for 4. She learned that his imprisonment had been engineered by Valdrek on the basis of a forged document, one that purported to show Magnus plotting against the council's authority. The blood-right vow, which the Aurel bloodline had lodged 3 centuries ago as a protection for their heir against exactly this kind of political persecution, had been the only mechanism capable of freeing him, which was why Valdrek's faction had spent 3 centuries making certain every translation attempt failed. She learned that when he looked at her, really looked at her, as he often did when she was explaining something she had found, or working through a problem aloud, he had a way of being completely, entirely present in the moment with her that she had never experienced from anyone else, human or otherwise. She learned that she wasn't in considerable trouble, emotionally speaking. On the 3rd morning, she was working at a desk in the common room, cross-referencing documents that Magnus had helped her access from the council's restricted archive, when he sat down across from her. Not across the table. Across, meaning he moved his chair to her side, close enough that she could feel the cool air that seemed to permanently surround him, and looked at what she was working on. The Ashbourne Compact, he said, reading upside down with effortless ease. You found the original. Lady Seraphine found it and had it sent to me. She thinks there is something in it that gives Valdrek's faction legal standing for his forgery charges against you, but I think she is looking at it backward. Marina traced a line on the document with her fingertip. Look at this section. The compact established the council's right to imprison a bloodline heir only under specific conditions. Condition 4 is critical. The evidence must be original, not transcribed. Valdrek's document was a transcription. He never produced the original because there was no original. Magnus leaned closer to look. She was acutely aware of him, of the precise inches between his shoulder and hers, of the way he smelled of old paper and something darker and cooler that she could not name. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, If you present this to the council with the blood-right vow translation, the forgery charge becomes provable under blood law. Yes, Valdrek will not accept that without a fight. No, Marina agreed, but Lady Seraphine has already spoken to 3 other council members who are not aligned with Valdrek's faction. And the fact that my translation has already been filed in 3 separate legal archives means that suppressing it now would create a paper trail that goes all the way to Geneva. The political cost of fighting this is higher than the cost of accepting it. Magnus looked at her with that expression again, the one she was starting to think of as his version of wonder, though she suspected he would object to the word. You have been planning this since you filed those copies, he said. I have been planning this since I found Article 17, she corrected. How long ago was that? 3 weeks before I presented the translation. He sat back, studying her. You spent 3 weeks preparing a legal and political strategy to free a vampire you had never met. I spent 3 weeks preparing a legal and political strategy to ensure that presenting a historically accurate translation of an ancient document would have the maximum possible effect, she said. You were, to be fair, a significant variable in that calculation. A significant variable, he repeated with something in his voice she could not quite interpret. A significant person, she said, more quietly, and did not look away from the document she was reading. The silence stretched between them, warm and complicated, and she felt rather than saw him shift beside her. Marina, he said. We should present this to the council tomorrow, she said. Give Lady Seraphine tonight to brief her allies. Marina, she looked up. He was watching her with those red eyes that she had stopped finding alarming sometime around the second morning, and had started finding, instead, like a door she very badly wanted to open. His expression was stripped of the careful composure he usually wore. He looked like himself, she thought, like the version of himself that existed under the 140 years of vampire court politics and 2 years of unjust imprisonment.
Thank you, he said, not for freeing me. Not for the translation. Just thank you.
Carrying the full weight of everything, Marina breathed. You would have done it for me, she said. She was not sure why she said it, except that she believed it entirely. She watched his face and knew she was right. Yes, he said. I would have. The council session the following morning was, in Marina's professional estimation, extremely eventful. Lady Seraphine opened the session with a procedural motion. Marina presented the Ashbourne Compact findings. The 3 council members Lady Seraphine had briefed provided supporting testimony. Valdrek sat at the center of the high bench, with the rigid stillness of a man watching a tower he had built over 3 centuries begin to crack. The critical moment came when Valdrek's ally, a narrow-faced lord named Archivist Aurel, stood up and suggested, not subtly, that Marina's findings were the product of a deliberate conspiracy between a human researcher with an agenda and a disgraced prisoner, and that the entire proceeding should be suspended pending a review of Marina's employment records, her financial history, and his voice went careful here, her continued fitness to work in the Nocturne archive. Magnus did not stand up. He simply went very still in his chair beside Marina, and the quality of that stillness was so absolute and so dangerous that Archivist Aurel stopped speaking mid-sentence. Finish that thought, Magnus said, very quietly. Aurel looked at Magnus and appeared to recalculate something. Lord Aurel, said Valdrek, his voice strained. You have no standing to threaten a council member. I made no threat, Magnus said. I asked Lord Aurel to complete his sentence. He seems to have decided against it. I respect his decision. He looked at Valdrek. Let me be clear about what happens next. Marina Sinclair's work is accurate, verified, and legally sound. Her employment records and personal history are irrelevant to the accuracy of her translations. If anyone in this chamber attempts to target her professionally or purposely as a means of suppressing legitimate scholarship, I will consider that a direct act of aggression against someone under my protection, and the consequences of that will be considerably less interesting to discuss than the Ashbourne Compact. The room was completely silent. Lady Seraphine, in the front row, looked like she was doing considerable work not to smile. Under my protection, Marina said quietly to him, under the cover of the silence. Yes, he murmured back without looking at her. Is that acceptable to you? She thought about 4 years of being dismissed, of being told she was too young, too human, too unimportant to touch these documents, to interpret these histories, to be heard by people who had been old when her great-grandparents were born. She thought about the tiny desk and the cold coffee and the dozens of moments she had swallowed her own certainty because the room told her to. Very acceptable, she said. The council voted at the end of a 6-hour session. The Bloodright vow translation was formally ratified. The forgery charges against Magnus Aurel were found to be based on inadmissible evidence. Valdrek did not speak during the vote. He simply watched, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who understood that the game had changed and was already thinking about the next one. Marina noticed this. She mentioned it to Magnus as they left the chamber. Valdrek does not concede, she said. He recalculates. I know, Magnus said. He held the door open for her with a gesture so automatic and unthinking that she doubted he was aware of it. He will try something else. He has a long view. That is what makes him dangerous. What will he try? Something that involves you, probably. You are the most visible element of this, the part he did not anticipate. They were walking down a corridor of pale stone, their footsteps very quiet. He underestimated you. Most people do, Marina said. Magnus stopped walking. She took 2 more steps before she realized and turned back. He was looking at her with that open, unguarded expression that still caught her off guard every time she saw it. I did not, he said. She looked at him in the quiet corridor. You had not met me yet. No, but I read your analysis of the Meridian texts in the Archive Quarterly 2 years ago, when I was already in prison. Lady Seraphine had it sent to me. I think because she thought I would find it interesting. He paused. I found it remarkable. I had a note made which was very difficult to do from inside a silver-threaded alcove to find out who wrote it. Marina stared at him. That paper was published in a journal that has a readership of approximately 40 people. I was one of them, he said simply. She did not know what to do with that. So she did what she usually did with information she needed time to process. She filed it very carefully and kept walking. Magnus fell into step beside her. That night, the danger Valdrek had been recalculating arrived. Marina was in her room, writing up a summary of the day's proceedings for the notarized record she was maintaining in Geneva, when the knock at her door came. Not Magnus, she knew his knock already. 3 precise raps. This was 2 fast ones, and then silence, which struck her as wrong before she could articulate why. She did not open the door. Instead, she went to the wall that connected her room to Magnus's and knocked 3 times precisely, and waited. He was there in under 20 seconds. He came through the connecting door that she had not previously noticed existed because it had been disguised as paneling, and he was already moving with the focused, dangerous precision of someone who had assessed the situation before she could explain it. 2 knocks, then silence. She said. Yes, he said. He positioned himself between her and the outer door, which struck her not as condescending but as completely natural, like a compass finding north. Stay back. He opened the door himself. The corridor was empty, but there was an envelope on the floor, a heavy cream-colored envelope with no name on it. Magnus picked it up without touching the seal with his bare skin, using the edge of his shirt, and brought it to the table. He examined it for a long moment. Sealed with a contact agent, he said. Old technique. If you had opened it with your hands, the seal would have broken and released something that would have been very unpleasant for a human with no supernatural resistance. He looked up. Your instinct not to open the door was correct. Marina sat down, not because she was shaking, she was not shaking, but because the sudden cold clarity of how close she had been to something bad was making her want to be sitting. Valdrek. Almost certainly Cassivus Rel, acting on Valdrek's behalf. Valdrek prefers not to be directly traceable. Magnus was still examining the envelope. This is a warning. They know contact agents are rarely fatal, just incapacitating. This is a message that says we can reach you. Well, Marina said after a moment, that is a fairly clear message. Yes. He set the envelope down and looked at her. In the low light of the room, the red of his eyes was very deep and very careful. I told you in the chamber that you were under my protection. I meant it as a legal and political claim, a deterrent. I did not mean it to sound like I was making your decisions for you. I know, she said. But I want to say it again now, differently, not as a political claim. He crossed to where she was sitting and crouched down to her level so that she was not looking up at him, so they were exactly eye to eye. I will not let them hurt you. That is a promise, not a legal one, a personal one. Marina looked at his face, open and certain, and carrying a weight of intention that she felt in her chest. Magnus, she said. Yes, when you read my paper in the Archive Quarterly. 2 years ago in prison, what exactly did you think? He blinked very slightly. The question had clearly landed outside the range of what he was expecting. I thought it was the most precise and unconventional analysis of meridian notation I had ever encountered, he said. And I thought whoever wrote it either had no idea they were doing something extraordinary, or knew exactly what they were doing and did not care if anyone noticed. The second one, Marina said. Yes, he said, with the ghost of a smile. I know that now, and now that you have met me. He held her gaze. The room was very quiet. Now that I have met you, he said, I think the paper was the least interesting thing about you, and the paper was extraordinary. She did not kiss him then. Neither of them was ready for that yet. Not with an envelope of political poison on the table, and a centuries-old power struggle still unresolved. But something shifted between them with the finality of a key turning in a lock, and they both felt it. Practical next steps. Marina said, because she needed to be practical or she was going to do something inadvisable. We need to escalate the contact agent incident to the Covenant House directly, Magnus said, straightening. But his voice carried something it had not carried before, something warmer, that she suspected was there to stay. Not the Council. The Covenant House is the neutral third-party arbiter under blood law. If we present evidence of an attempted assault on a verified translator who appeared before the Council under legal protections, Valdrek's faction loses its ability to claim any moral or procedural ground. Can we prove Rel sent it? I know who to ask, Magnus said. There are members of the House staff who were not placed here by Valdrek and who have very long memories of what this court looked like before his faction consolidated. Lady Seraphine has been cultivating those relationships for decades. She anticipated that something like this might happen. Lady Seraphine, Marina said, is extraordinary. She is, Magnus agreed. And she will want to know about this tonight. She will not be pleased. Lady Seraphine was not pleased. She arrived in their sitting room 20 minutes after Magnus sent a message, wearing a dressing gown that somehow managed to look authoritative. Examined the envelope, with the focused efficiency of someone who had been navigating vampire court politics for 600 years, and said, with tremendous precise quiet, that Archivist Rel had made a significant error in judgment. Then she made 4 calls on a phone that looked considerably more modern than Marina had expected her to own, spoke briefly and with utter calm, and told Magnus and Marina to be ready to appear before the Covenant House arbiter by 9 the following morning. This is no longer simply about Magnus's freedom, she said. This is an assault on the testimony of a legally protected witness. Under the Covenant, that is a Category 1 violation. Valdrek can survive having his forgery exposed. He cannot survive having his faction implicated in a Category 1 violation, while the evidence is already filed in 3 neutral archives. Marina looked at her. You knew something like this would happen. Lady Seraphine looked back, and her expression was not unkind. I knew that Valdrek would not accept defeat gracefully, and that you were the most obvious pressure point. I made certain that any pressure he applied would leave a mark he could not remove. She paused. I also knew that Magnus would not let anything happen to you. That was the other variable I was counting on. Magnus, beside Marina, said nothing. Marina did not look at him, but she felt the warmth of him very clearly. Get some rest, Lady Seraphine said. Both of you, tomorrow will be interesting. She swept out. Magnus looked at Marina. Marina looked at the connecting door, which was still open. You do not need to stay, she said. Lady Seraphine's staff will be in the corridor now. I know, he said. He did not move toward the connecting door. Magnus, you could, he said carefully. Continue to tell me all the reasons I should be in the other room, or you could tell me one reason I should stay, and I will act on that one instead. Marina sat with that for one long breath. I sleep better with you on the other side of the wall, she said. That is probably a reason. It is an excellent reason, he said, and he did not go to the other room, but he did go to the chair beside the window, and he sat in it, and she lay down on the bed, and the silence between them was the most comfortable silence she had ever inhabited. She was asleep in 10 minutes. She did not know that he watched over her the entire night, and that when the first pale light came through the curtained windows, he looked at her sleeping face with an expression that was the oldest thing he had ever felt. The Covenant House arbiter was a vampire named Thessaly Vaughan. Ancient in the way that certain things are ancient, like deep stone or still water, and she had the manner of someone for whom politics was weather, always changing, never surprising. She received Marina's testimony about the contact agent envelope with absolute precise attention, asked 7 follow-up questions that were so exactly the right questions that Marina silently revised her estimate of vampire institutional design significantly upward, and then reviewed the physical evidence that Lady Seraphine's people had collected overnight. Archivist Rel's family seal is embedded in the contact agent compound, Thessaly said. That is either extraordinary carelessness or evidence that he expected this not to be reported through channels where it could be analyzed. He expected her to open the envelope, Magnus said. Yes, Thessaly said. He expected an incapacitated human researcher who would be quietly removed from the proceeding for health reasons. She looked at Marina with something that might have been respect. He did not plan for a human researcher who recognized that 2 knocks followed by silence was wrong. 4 years in a vampire archive, Marina said. You learn to notice things. Thessaly allowed herself the smallest of smiles. I imagine you do. She closed the evidence folder. Lord Aurel, the Covenant House finds in your favor on all matters related to the Bloodright vow translation and the subsequent proceedings. Cassivus Rel will be formally censured and removed from the High Council, pending a full investigation into the contact agent incident. Lord Valdrek Ashbourne will receive an official notification that the Covenant House is reviewing his faction's conduct during your imprisonment, including the question of the forged document's origin. That review will be uncomfortable for him, Magnus said. It will be extremely uncomfortable, Thessaly confirmed. It was always going to be uncomfortable, eventually. Miss Sinclair simply accelerated the timeline by about 2 centuries. She looked at Marina again. For what it is worth, the Nocturne Archive has had a standing request before this office for the past 15 years, asking that human researchers be granted expanded access and legal protections equivalent to those afforded vampire scholars. That request has been repeatedly blocked by Lord Valdrek's faction. Marina went very still. I did not know that. Most people in your position do not. Thessaly closed the folder. That request will be granted before the end of the month. I suspect you will find your working conditions significantly improved. It took Marina a moment to process the full scope of what Thessaly was saying. Not just her own conditions. Every human researcher in the archive system. 4 years of cold coffee, and too small desk, and being dismissed by people who thought her work was a charming amateur effort, was the experience of everyone who looked like her in those archives, and it was going to change. She thought about that for a long time as they walked back through the Covenant House corridors, Magnus at her side, close enough that their hands occasionally brushed. You are quiet, he said. I am thinking about the other researchers, she said. The ones who have been doing this longer than me. Dr. Faris has been in the archive for 11 years. He has a desk the same size as mine. He has 7 published translations that have been cited in Covenant House proceedings 11 times, and he has never once been invited to present testimony. Magnus was quiet for a moment. You are planning something. I am thinking about what comes next, she said, after all of this, when it is less urgent. He stopped walking. She took another 2 steps and turned back because apparently that was becoming a pattern. Marina, he said, what do you want to happen next? She studied him in the corridor, under lights that were the color of candlelight, white-haired and red-eyed, and entirely himself. She thought about the paper in the Archive Quarterly that he had read in prison and found remarkable. She thought about 3 raps on a wall in the dark, and coffee carried to a door in the morning, and a chair by a window where he had sat all night without being asked. I want to make the archive better, she said. I want to do the work. I want to keep translating. She held his gaze. And I would very much like to continue doing it in the same building as you. Something in his face did something she did not have a word for. The Aurel family holdings include a library, he said. Historic. The collection is significant. It has been unmanaged for 2 years. Is it an employment offer? It is, he said, a preliminary overture toward a number of things, of which employment is the least interesting. Marina Sinclair, who had spent 4 years being told she was not significant, looked at the vampire heir, standing in front of her in a Covenant House corridor, and made a decision the way she made all her best decisions, with her whole mind and her whole heart at once. Tell me about the others, she said. He crossed the 2 steps between them and took her hand, carefully, as though she were something remarkable that he did not want to damage, which was, she thought, completely wrong as a metaphor for her. She was not fragile, but it was the most tender thing anyone had ever communicated to her, so she let it stand. The library first, he said, then the rest. They did not kiss then either. But they were moving toward it the way continents move, without hurry and without stopping. The weeks that followed were, by any reasonable measure, the most extraordinary of Marina's life, which set a high bar given what the previous month had already contained. The Aurel family holdings were restored formally through a Covenant House order. The estate in question was a property outside Edinburgh, built in the 17th century on foundations that were considerably older. a structure that from the outside looked like an extremely large and historically significant manor house, and from the inside looked like someone had taken 3 centuries of vampire aristocratic taste and applied it without restraint. The library was the east wing, 2 stories of floor-to-ceiling shelves, a gallery above, oak reading tables that had been used by people who had watched the Renaissance happen firsthand, and approximately 12,000 volumes, the oldest of which predated the printing press by several hundred years. Marina stood in the center of it on the first morning, turned slowly in a circle, and said, "Oh," in the tone of someone who has just been handed the thing they wanted most in the world. Magnus watched her from the doorway with an expression that he had stopped trying to conceal sometime in the 3rd week. She worked. She catalogued, cross-referenced identified texts that had been miscatalogued, found 3 documents of significant historical and legal importance that had been filed under incorrect headings by someone in the 1800s who had apparently not understood early sanguine at all, and wrote an initial assessment report that made Lady Seraphine, when she visited in the 4th week, say "remarkable" 3 times, and then immediately make 2 phone calls. Magnus worked too. He had spent 2 years in an alcove, and the recalibration of freedom took time and intention. He managed the estate's affairs, navigated the ongoing Covenant House review with the careful precision of someone who had spent 140 years learning how vampire courts worked, and spent his evenings in the library with Marina. Those evenings were the heart of it. The thing that grew between them, substantial and unignorable, was built in the spaces between the work. In the conversations that started as professional and became personal without ever leaving the room. In the way he brought her tea at 10 o'clock without being asked, and she had stopped thanking him for it because it had simply become part of the landscape of the evening. In the way they sat on opposite sides of the same reading table and looked up at the same moment and found the other one already looking. In the conversation 3 weeks into Edinburgh, when Magnus said quietly, without looking up from the document he was examining, "My mother was Kealindra. She was the one who originally lodged the blood-right vow. She lodged it because she had already seen enough of Valdrec's politics to know that it would eventually be needed." Marina set down her pen. "How long ago?" "She died 112 years ago. Not at Valdrec's hand, just time. Some vampires do not survive indefinitely." He paused. "She would have found you extraordinary. You keep using that word about me." "It is the accurate word," he said, and looked up, and they were eye to eye across the oak table. And the evening outside had gone fully dark, and the library was lit with the warm gold of reading lamps. And Marina Sinclair thought that this was the most beautiful room she had ever been in, and it had nothing to do with the 12,000 books. "Magnus," she said. "Yes, the preliminary overtures you mentioned in the Covenant House corridor." He set down his own pen. "Yes, I would like to revisit those." He stood up from his chair, and she stood up from hers, and they met in the middle of the reading table on the same side of it. Because they had both stopped pretending that the table was a necessary boundary, sometime around on the 6th week. He cupped her face in both hands, his touch the same as everything else about him. Certain and careful and entirely without hesitation, and she reached up and held his wrists, and they stayed like that for one long breath in which everything that had been building since a council chamber in London and a translation on amber vellum arrived at exactly where it needed to be. "I have never," he said, "in 140 years met anyone who made me want to stop moving and simply be somewhere." "You are somewhere now," she said. "I know," he said. "That is because of you." She kissed him, or he kissed her. It was the kind of kiss that begins with a decision made by 2 people at exactly the same moment, warm and absolute, and nothing like a first kiss in the sense of uncertain or tentative. It was like translating a vow in a language you had been learning for years, and finally reading the 3rd tier, the negation clause, the meaning underneath the meaning. The Covenant House review of Valdrec's conduct concluded in the 6th week. The findings were extensive, precisely documented, and deeply damaging to Valdrec's political position. The forged document that had imprisoned Magnus was traced, through the analysis of its ink compound and the testimony of 2 staff members who had been present during its creation, to Magnus Aurel's personal correspondence Acting on specific instructions from Valdrek Ashbourne, Valdrek did not deny it. He was too old and too proud for denial, and Marina had the impression that he had known for some time that this reckoning was coming, that he had simply bet on it, arriving after his position was secured enough to survive it, and lost that bet to a human archivist with an archive quarterly paper and 3 notarized copies of a translation filed with neutral institutions. He was removed from the High Council and stripped of his voting rights under blood law. He did not go quietly, which nobody expected, and he did not go without making one final attempt at relevance, which also nobody found surprising. The attempt came as a formal challenge to Magnus's restored heir status, filed through an obscure procedural mechanism that none of the current council members had seen invoked in over a century. It required Magnus to prove his right to the Aurel bloodline title by producing or accounting for every holding and privilege associated with that title, including any active blood oaths that might supersede his claim. Magnus read the filing with total calm. Then he called Marina into the study and handed it to her. She read it. Then she read it again. Then she said, "This references the bloodright vow a second time. There is a sub-clause that Valdrek believes supersedes the vow's negation." "Yes," Magnus said. "He is wrong," she said. "The sub-clause uses classical sanguine grammar, but the word he is relying on, the one that looks like it means supersede, actually means adjacent in early sanguine script of that period. They wrote it in the same register as the rest of the document, but used an older word. It does not supersede the negation. It supports it. Can you prove that?" She looked up at him. "I already have. I documented that word specifically in my original translation notes because I thought it might come up." She paused. "I thought it might come up because, when I was preparing the presentation for the council, I noticed that Valdrek was consulting with someone who looked like a procedural specialist, and I made a note that he might be preparing a counter-argument." Magnus stared at her. "You anticipated Valdrek's counter-argument before you even walked into the chamber." "I anticipated that someone would try a counter-argument," she said. "Valdrek was the most likely candidate. So I prepared documentation for every potential objection I could identify." She handed the filing back to him. "Send a copy of my translation notes to the Covenant House with the relevant passage flagged. The challenge will be dismissed within a week." Magnus held the filing and looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "Marina Sinclair, you walked into that council chamber not just with a translation. You walked in with a case." "I walked in with everything I needed," she said simply. "I was not willing to do this halfway." He set the filing on the desk and crossed to her and took her hands in both of his, and the look on his face was the most open she had ever seen him, which was saying something because he had been progressively less armored for weeks. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right, I am aware that this began as something you did out of principle, and I would not diminish that. Your principles are one of the things I most admire about you. But I want you to know that whatever began as principle for me has become something that is entirely and without condition personal. You are the most significant person in my life. You are the most significant person in 140 years of a life, and I am not saying this because you freed me or because you protected me in the Covenant House proceedings, but because of who you are when you are sitting across from me at that table with cold tea going stale beside you and a document open on your lap, and you look up and you are so completely yourself that I forget I am supposed to be measured." Marina looked at him for a long time. The evening light was coming through the study window in long gold bars, and he was standing in it, white-haired and red-eyed and entirely, undeniably real. "I love you," she said. She had known it for weeks. She had simply been waiting for the moment when saying it was more true than not saying it, and that moment had clearly arrived. Something moved through his face that was more than emotion. It was recognition. As though he had been waiting for this, in the way she had waited for the vow to make sense, knowing the meaning was there, needing only the right frame of reference to see it. "I love you," he said. "I believe I have loved you since the Meridian paper, which is probably an unreasonable admission." "It is a completely reasonable admission," she said, "from someone who reads Archive quarterly." He laughed, and it was the most extraordinary sound she had ever heard from him, full and unguarded and warm. and she thought she would spend a very long time making it happen again. Valdrek's final procedural challenge was dismissed in 5 days, not 7. The Covenant House arbiter Thessaly Vaughan sent a brief note along with the dismissal that read, "The documentation provided by Miss Sinclair is thorough enough to be used as a reference standard for early sanguine grammatical analysis. We are recommending it for the Covenant House archive." Thessaly Vaughan, arbiter. Marina read the note at the library table. Magnus read it over her shoulder. She turned to look at him and found him already looking at her. "They are putting your notes in the Covenant House archive," he said. "Apparently. That is a singular honor." "It is a very unexpected Wednesday," she said, which made him smile. In that way she had catalogued, precisely and completely, as one of her favorite things in the world. The formal changes at the Nocturne archive were confirmed in the 8th week. The expanded protections for human researchers went into effect with a thoroughness that Marina suspected had been in preparation for longer than the current crisis, waiting only for the political conditions to shift. Dr. Faris was offered a senior research position. 3 other human scholars received formal academic recognition for work that had been cited without attribution for years. Marina was offered the position of Chief Archivist for the Oral Collection, a title that had never previously existed. She accepted it from a phone call she made sitting in the East Wing Library, surrounded by 12,000 books. With Magnus on the other end of the oak reading table watching her, and when she ended the call and told him what the title was, he looked at her with such triumphant pride that she had to look away briefly because it was too much. The good kind of too much, the kind that sits behind your sternum and makes it difficult to breathe normally. "Chief Archivist," he said. "Chief Archivist," she confirmed. "They called you the Archivist in the council chamber," he said, "when Valdrek was listing reasons to dismiss you. He said it like it was a lesser thing." "Yes, he was wrong about that too," Magnus said. She knew he was not just talking about the title. She knew he was talking about all of it. The 4 years, the tiny desk, the cold coffee, the polite dismissals from people who had centuries of accumulated authority and used it to make her feel like the margins of a document rather than the text. "He was wrong," she agreed. "And we both know how that ended." "With you at the center of the room," Magnus said. "Which is exactly where you should be. 2 months after the council chamber, 1 month after Edinburgh, 3 weeks after the Covenant House review concluded. Magnus Aurel took Marina Sinclair on what she privately considered the most unconventionally perfect evening she could have imagined. He had asked Lady Seraphine, who had apparently become his default source of human world cultural consultation, how to plan an evening that a human woman who loved history, books, ancient languages, and extremely good coffee would consider meaningful rather than merely impressive. Lady Seraphine had given him a list, and he had executed it with the same precise, unhurried confidence he brought to everything. They went to the oldest continuously operating bookshop in Edinburgh, which closed at 6, but had agreed to stay open for a private evening visit, the kind of arrangement that Magnus could make because he had the combination of natural authority and quiet resource that opened doors without requiring theatrics. They walked through it for an hour, pulling things off shelves, reading passages aloud to each other, disagreeing about the merits of a particular 17th century anatomist with considerable intellectual vigor. Then they had dinner at a restaurant that was warm and small, and where the waiter knew Magnus by name and brought Marina coffee at the end of the meal without being asked, because Magnus had apparently called ahead about the coffee as well. Then they walked back to the estate through the Edinburgh streets, which at midnight were quiet and fog-misted and lit by the kind of light that made old stone look like it belonged to another century, which it largely did, and Magnus held her hand with the same certainty he did everything else, on the steps of the estate before they went in. He stopped. "I want to tell you something that I have been considering how to say for approximately 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks is a long time to consider a sentence, Marina said. This is a significant sentence, he said. I wanted to get it right. She waited. My life is a long one, he said. I do not know with certainty how long, but considerably longer than a human span. That is a fact that has implications I will not pretend away, because you deserve honesty, and you deserve to make choices with full information. I am not asking you to make any particular choice tonight. I am not asking anything except that you know that whatever comes next, whatever the shape of this is, I intend to be in it with everything I have, for as long as you will let me. And I intend to spend that time being someone worthy of the person who walked into a council chamber with 3 notarized copies and a very steady voice and gave me my life back. Marina looked at him on the steps of a 17th century estate on an Edinburgh night, her hair escaping its pins exactly as it always did, her archivist's badge in her coat pocket, the man she loved looking at her like she was the most important document he had ever been entrusted with. Magnus, she said. Yes, get the sentence right. He looked at her for one long beat. Then very quietly, with the certainty of a vow lodged 3 centuries in advance for exactly the right moment, stay. She stepped forward, and he caught her, and they stood on the steps of the estate, with the Edinburgh fog around them, and all the centuries behind him, and all the years ahead of them, and the careful, steadfast, extraordinary thing they had built between them, settled into place like the last piece of a translation, like the 3rd tier of a vow, like the meaning underneath. The meaning that was there all along, waiting only for someone willing to look. Yes, she said. Obviously, yes. The Covenant House filed its final report on the oral proceedings in the 10th week, and its concluding section contained a passage that Thessaly Vaughan later told Marina had never been included in a Covenant House report before. It read, "The resolution of this matter was made possible by the scholarly precision and personal courage of Marina Sinclair, human archivist, whose translation of the Bloodright Vow demonstrates that the greatest barriers to understanding are not linguistic but political, and that the accurate preservation of historical truth is not a minor institutional concern, but the foundational act of justice in any society, immortal or otherwise." Marina read it at the library table. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at the ceiling for a moment, not because she was trying not to cry, because she did not cry particularly easily, but because she was allowing herself to feel the full weight of it. Magnus came to stand beside her. He read the passage. He did not say anything immediately, which was one of the things she had come to love about him, the way he understood when a moment needed to breathe. Then he said, "Dr. Faris will see this." "Yes," she said. "And the other researchers?" "Yes, good," he said simply. And then after a beat, "You did that. We did that," she corrected. He looked at her. The red of his eyes was warm, which she had thought was impossible when she first saw him and had since learned was entirely possible, the same eyes in a completely different light. "You walked in first," he said. "You backed me up." "Always," he said. "For as long as you want me to." She reached up and took his hand, laced her fingers through his, held on with the same certainty she had held the vellum in the council chamber. The thing that mattered, the thing worth holding. "That is a very long time," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "It is." Outside the east wing windows, Edinburgh was bright with an early autumn afternoon, the kind of slanted, golden light that makes old cities look like they are remembering themselves. Inside, the 12,000 books stood in their rows, patient and particular, full of the kind of truth that takes the right reader to unlock. The chief archivist of the oral collection sat at her oak reading table, with her notes spread around her, and the vampire heir of the oldest bloodline in the Covenant House record beside her, and they worked, and they talked, and they disagreed about a footnote in an 11th century text with considerable enthusiasm. And the evening came in gold through the windows, and the lamps were lit, and the tea went cold beside them, and neither of them noticed until much later. The mockery was over, the vow had been read, the air was free, and the archivist, who had walked into a room full of ancient power, with notarized copies and a steady voice, and the precise, uncompromising belief that the truth in a document mattered, had found the one thing she had never thought to catalogue in advance. She had found someone who read her like a language he had been waiting his whole long life to speak, and she had found that she was, in the end, entirely fluent in him.